Hello, thank you everyone. This is Mike Grossman. Thank you, Eugene, for that introduction. Appreciate everybody taking the time today to stop by and take a look at what we have to discuss with you. So today I am going to talk about the Oracle Life Sciences Data Hub and a way that we, through best practice, can actually rapidly get LSH, as I'll refer to it, up and running within your organization fairly quickly. Just a bit about who I am. I run the clinical warehousing group at BioPharm, and I've been doing that since 2010. I've spent a significant amount of time at Oracle working on Life Sciences Hub and other products, and I was also the head of clinical programming at Roche and some other experience. So I've been at this for quite some time. So today what I really want to talk about is, first of all, to introduce the topic. What do we really mean by managing patient data? What are the best practices? As we've worked with several companies, many companies around that. What are the data flows that we see that support managing patient data? A little bit of emphasis on conforming data, as you'll see that becomes part of the story. What are the tools and utilities that you need to actually support this kind of approach? What's the underlying infrastructure? What are the strategies around implementing a system or an environment like this? And then how do you support that in production? And then we'll finish up with some conclusions and have time for questions and answers. So as I'm going through the presentation, if you have questions, you can type them, as Eugene said, right as they occur to you. And I will probably save time at the end to answer them, but if I see one or two that I can answer right on the fly, that's fine as well. So you don't need to wait until the end to actually post your questions. Okay, so what do we mean by managing patient data? So during the running of clinical trials, you capture the data with various systems. EDC obviously is the primary system of data capture, but you could have central lab data, IVRX data, you could be getting data from CROs, you could be a CRO that's getting data from sponsors or partners, and legacy data as well. So it's everything that happens after you capture the data. So I'm not really going to focus on the data capture side, but all the things that you need to do with the data after you capture it, and have done a very high-level initial cleaning of the data that you would typically do with an EDC system. In addition, we're not limiting it just to the patient data, but there's a lot of data that surrounds the patient data, such as metrics data and CTMS data. That also can be included in the overall umbrella of patient data. The focus really is on the eCRF data and the data about the patient, their health, their efficacy, etc. But CTMS data and metrics data is also part of the picture. So built around the concept of what we're trying to do is to put together a best practice business process. And the business process around managing the data really has to do with taking the data and making it available to the wider clinical community within as short a period as possible. And what we've seen as a best practice is really to set a service level of around 24 hours. So every day, every change to every study is available for review, for data cleaning, for analysis, for all the things that you would want to do with the data. That's a service level that we find is a best practice. And it's a service level that many companies have not yet achieved. And we think with a standard approach to architecting how you move the data through and to manage this data, that can certainly be achieved even by the largest of companies. Another key best practice is that when you have that first patient first visit, and that data starts coming in either through IVRS or EDC, that you have a set of data review tools available within that first 24 hours. That the data listings don't come 6 weeks later or 8 weeks later, but in fact are available immediately. In addition, if your statistics group is very proactive and they have a statistical analysis plan signed and approved around the time the protocol is approved, then in fact they should be able to start executing on the formal analysis shortly after the first patient visit. Now, typically this doesn't happen within 24 hours because the data is so sparse. It's just screening data or maybe some enrollment data. But certainly within a week or two after the first patient first visit, we really would expect that you could start running formal analysis, more in a test mode, and verifying your tables, listings, and figures are coming together. And for safety Addon data sets in particular, there's no reason that you shouldn't be able to have, if you've got standard conform data on data capture, that you can get the Addon data sets available on the safety side immediately after first patient first visit. In addition, if you want to use tools such for cross-study analysis, such as Spotfire or JReview or something like that, that whole flow all the way through from data capture through to that cross-study analysis is something that you would expect to have available very shortly after the first live data comes through. The infrastructure and the design and the approach needs to be in place before you even start the study. But if you take a best practice approach, this is certainly achievable. So what's important in supporting all these business processes, statistical analysis, ongoing data review by data management, ongoing listings for medical review, cross-study analysis, is you really have to have a flow for the data planned out and architected before you actually create the study. So the data flow that we recommend is to start with taking study-specific data and staging it. And staging it basically means take the data as it is. Don't try and transform it. Don't try and clean it. Just stage the data from whatever systems you're using and get it into a central location where you can begin working with that study-specific data. In addition, immediately upon staging the data, you can get study-specific views for cross-study data setup. So there's some unioning that can occur. Very early on, hopefully on test data, you've actually mapped to a conform standard. So my study-specific data for demography, adverse events, concomitant medication, all your standard data sets out of the box, first thing you want to do is map to a conform standard. Now, mapping to a conform standard is not the same thing as programming that conforming. This would include both the safety and the efficacy data. There needs to be a process for standard data review and reporting. So this is not a study-specific activity. You need an infrastructure and you need a set of business processes in order to review the data so that the data is available to the wider clinical team right from the beginning. And this means you have to plan it out ahead of time, but that you need a standard set of tools and processes ready to go that sits on top of the conform data. Now, if you don't conform the data, then your ability to have standard data review tools is greatly reduced. So the conforming step is absolutely essential to rapidly getting the data into the hands of the wider clinical team. Another aspect is as you're running the value-added data sets, creating Addon data sets, and you're running the analysis, it's important that that analysis result is in fact available to the data management, stats, but also medical review, science, CRAs, study managers, the entire organization. So even though our experience has shown that some companies do their analysis inside Life Sciences Hub, other companies do their analysis outside of Life Sciences Hub, we strongly recommend the best practice of data flow is that it doesn't stop at the conform data, but in fact the analysis results, the Addon data sets, the value-added data sets, those all exist within the same infrastructure so that they're available for the data review, for medical review, for safety review, for data mining, etc. We would like to see the cross-study views pool automatically. And then if you have special purpose data marts, those can sit right on top of the pooled views. And these might be the type of data marts that you'd use for a medical review system in case you're actually doing safety patient review. Typically, you would use a tool like Spotfire or JReview to do that medical review, and you need to have that available out of the box and not really have study-specific technical solutions that delay the medical review from starting months or sometimes even 6 to 8 months we have seen. So the idea really is get these data marts ready to sit right on top of the pooled, conformed study data so that your medical review process can start right from the beginning of the study. So how do you do this? It's nice to talk about what the best practice is, but how do you actually set up that best practice and make that realizable in a rapid way? Well, the first thing is you need to have an overall reference architecture so that as each clinical trial comes along, and maybe you're getting it from different EDC systems, different sources, different CROs, different parties, and different labs, etc., that you know exactly how your data is going to flow ahead of time. And it is based on, this architecture is really based on a 3-hop or 3-copy concept. So you basically have your inbound data sources. You stage your data as is, so you do not manipulate the data. So you have an exact copy of the data, be it physical or virtual, that you actually can trace back to your source system. Then in a single set of transformations, you move that to your conformed structure. And this is what I'm talking about in the operational area. And that conformed structure may be based on something like CDISC SDTM. And some companies are struggling a little bit with SDTM, and they extend SDTM to fit all their purposes. It's not actually critical that it be an industry standard at the operational level. What is critical is that it is conformed to some sort of standard that your organization is familiar with. In that, the reason it needs to be a single-step transformation is if you go through multiple steps of transformation, significant multiple steps of transformation, it works fine for small organizations and smaller studies, but it really doesn't scale for the large organizations if you go multi-stage processing. Once you have the conformed area, for each one of your delivery mechanisms, you would actually have what is labeled here as a warehouse area, which really is the ability to have your predefined reports, your predefined analysis, your predefined medical review, all sitting on top of something that's optimized for that particular purpose. Now, in some cases, certain analytical tools may be able to sit directly on top of the operational data, and that's absolutely fine. But what's very important is that you don't spend too much effort transforming the data from one step to the other and make too many copies of the data. So you really need this 3-hop approach. Otherwise, I think you run into some scalability problems. What's also very important is that infrastructure where this is happening in terms of the tools is a common infrastructure, and that you don't actually have different set of browsing tools depending on what department is doing the browsing. The data analysis and data browsing tools really need to be suitable, a subset of what's available on the market, and suitable for the specific purpose, and not driven from what inbound system they were taken from. So you don't need Actuate from one system and JReview for another system and SAS for another system. If you want to use OBIEE and SAS and Spotfire, those are all integrated to look at any of these areas, the staging area, the operational area, or the warehouse area. Okay, let's go to the next slide. Okay, so I'm going to drill a little bit of detail about each one of these main areas. So staging data, which is getting the data in, is what are the best practices we've seen? Well, first let's talk about EDC data. What's very important on the EDC side is for OCRDC, as an EDC system, we are a direct connect from OCRDC we've seen is what works the best. Currently, the LSH comes with an OCRDC connector. It works very well. It is not an incremental data connector. It scales pretty well, but it is possible to also do some incremental processing there if necessary. For Rave, what we've seen is both web services and file-based. Now, many companies have a future plan to start using Rave web services for the interface, but many companies have not actually made it to that step yet, in which case their SAS files on demand is the way to pull data into a tool like LSH and actually start analyzing it. So we work both with web services and with files. Inform is very much in a similar situation, but since Inform is an Oracle application, you can easily pull the files, and that's really how we've worked historically. And there's a new product that layers on top of Life Sciences Data Hub called the Data Management Workbench, which I'll talk about a little bit later, that actually has a web services-based connector to Informs. What's important, though, is that you always have that file-based approach available in your business process, because you can work with a file-based connector with any EDC system. And so if you can automate that file-based staging, you're not really limited in terms of business process on what you can do. When we've worked with other systems, such as LIMS system, like Watson LIMS, IVR systems, CTMS systems, we really found a direct connect to be the best way to work. So this direct connect typically is something using a technique called database link, but there are other connection methods as well. And really the idea is you just pull the data that you need exactly when you need it, on demand. So in a sense, you would have a pass-through view from your warehouse, your life sciences hub environment, and actually would pass directly through to LIMS and IVR systems. And then basically you need a file-based load for systems that are not used internally repeatedly. Now, one of the things that I'm going to talk about is some utilities. Automated file load is essential to a rapid setup of a study. If you're working with a SAS group, which may be a statistics group or another group that basically receives SAS data sets, if you want to manually create those structures, it's fine. It works fine with LSH. But our experience has been if they can just point a data set to a location and say, give me one of those, we've been much more successful. And we've had quite a few clients actually work with automated file loading. And then the last best practice around staging data is if you are working with a system such as a LIMS system that has PK data, you can't really have that exposed to the general community, because those tend to be very normalized systems, and you will have all the study data in a single set of tables. And since that data is blinded, you really need to mask study-specific views of those data and potentially handle blinding on a study-specific basis, even though the source system itself would unblind everything. So there's a very significant security aspect when you're doing a direct connect to systems that don't store their data as study-specific data. And the recommended best practice is to create study-specific blinded views of that data, and that's really what the study teams work with from the beginning of the study. So moving into the operational layer, which is to conform. So the hard part of conforming data, and by the way, this is the most labor-intensive part of the overall patient management steps. The hard part is not necessarily writing the code to conform the data. The hard part is getting the business teams to agree on how a particular eCRF maps to the standard. So what's very, very important is when you map to a standard structure, it's a specification process. That's actually where the heavy lifting is. Now, there's a second step, which is programming, which we would like to avoid. But managing that specification process where data management and statistics and potentially clinical operations and some people from regulatory need to sit around a virtual table and actually write a specification, this is where the industry really needs help, and it really has to work well. In fact, there's a number of tools out there that help with the programming aspect, but in terms of managing in a user-friendly way, the actual agreement on the mapping is the place, I think, where the industry is weak. Reusability is the key to saving time and effort. So if you have a particular eCRF page that you've used in one study, or a particular structure that you've used in one study, and you encounter that again in another study, the specification of the mapping to the conformed structure should be automatic. somehow there needs to be a smart way of saying, look, I've already seen this eCRF, I've already mapped it, I've already validated it, let's just grab that. So you want to set up an architecture and organization that lets that search and retrieval actually be fairly simple. One of the other aspects of conforming data that's also very complex and gives people some grief is the fact that once you've got your data conformed, at some point you have to export it to a regulatory authority, and they have to understand how you've conformed the data. Now, just giving the CRF location in CDISC SDTM is the start, but the algorithm of how it got there, and although the FDA does not require that they can re-execute your code, they need the pseudocode so they can understand the algorithm that you've used to conform your data. So at the end, you need to be able to export anything that you do in this environment and document it so that others, partners, regulatory agencies, etc., can actually see what you've done and see how the data got from point A to point B. And what we've also seen for best practices is the target service level of processing is once per day. Now, obviously, at file closure, you may want to do more than that, but the typical service level that we would recommend is once per day. Now, if the business is expecting an update once per day, that implies that you need some recovery time if something goes wrong. So in the ideal world, we recommend that you load or stage and conform the data at double the service level. So that would be twice a day. So that if there's a failure at one point, you have time to recover and still meet that service level. So this is very important. And while you can create studies that go through massive transformations and they're successful, the idea that you have 30, 40, 50 studies a day, processing twice a day, actually makes that quite a challenge. So performance is really very important here. So I've already talked a little bit about conforming data using a process approach. So really it's a specification process that you really need the data manager to look at how the past mappings have happened for their eCRF pages, and they need to sit with the statistician and say, this is what my conformed data sets are going to look like. And the conformed data sets, they know what they're going to look like, but they have to understand what data, what code lists are going where, or DVGs if you're used to Oracle Clinical. We actually recommend a process where they specify using a tool like Excel, because using an online tool can actually be very, very cumbersome. You're not really emailing things around. You're not sitting in meeting rooms. What we've seen is, independent of the tools that actually people use, whether it be pure programming, whether they use a tool like Informatica, whether they use a custom metadata mapping tool, the discussion of what maps to what always ends up in Excel. And you may not like Excel, or you may like Excel. It's not a judgment on the quality of the tool. At the end, that's the communication tool that we see being used in the field. As each specification occurs, you want to keep it under version control, treat it like a regulatory compliant document, pull that mapping specification out, do whatever technical things you need to do to actually make it run. And we'll talk a little bit more about that as some of the options that are available on the market there. But it's really the specification process and really handling it as a document almost, rather than handling it as a programmer's guide or as a special purpose tool that only highly trained people can use. So it's a very important concept. Otherwise, the mapping specifications tend to get hung up on the business process, not necessarily in the programming stage, and the cycles become too long. So the next step really is what we were looking at as the warehouse area, but it's really about data delivery. So what we've seen in best practices on data delivery is automatic delivery to stats. So basically, either they can just run a little SAS macro or a big SAS macro and get the data on demand, or they get the data every day, but that there's no special copying of data sets or anything like that. If stats is not being executed inside LSH, They really need to just be able to go in and start running their analysis, and then they can create their snapshots either in LSH or outside LSH as needed. But it needs to be as simple as a SAS macro if they're working outside LSH. We really have not seen great success with training statistics departments just to log into LSH, extracting their data, and then log back out. Same thing for loading it. So what we've seen as best practice is really for statistics departments that are not working inside LSH is to create a series of SAS macros that let them directly interface with LSH in terms of both pulling data and pushing data back into the LSH environment. And we take advantage of the generic business area for that function in terms of the best practice. Ongoing data review should be available in Spotfire and JReview. So you can look at the data using various tools, including OBIEE. There's a data browser inside LSH. The new data management workbench has a data browser. But the reality is in the field, people have made a huge investment in Spotfire and JReview, creating complex templates and reports. That really needs to be the same data that STATS is looking at, and very often will be supplemented with statistical data. So a very important part of the overall ecosystem for data review is to make sure that you've got JReview or Spotfire or both, depending on your company's preference, so that you can look at the data right away. The LSH by itself really doesn't tell the whole picture. And in addition, that data can be supplemented, particularly with retention data, enrollment data, randomization data, etc. Can be supplemented with IVR systems and CTMS systems. And there's a great example of that actually being achieved in the real world with clinical development analytics sitting on top of LSH. And clinical development analytics in this case is an Oracle product that actually can be built inside LSH. So we have these three steps: staging, conforming, and then we have delivery of the data to the various user communities. This is just a quick screenshot of clinical development analytics. For those of you that aren't familiar with it, that's not really the purpose, but just to show that you can have highly interactive data sitting inside LSH, whether it be Spotfire, OBIEE, etc., so that your clinical teams have immediate access to the data. And LSH is somewhat plumbing at that point. It's invisible, this warehouse we're talking about. But it's only invisible if it works, if the data is fresh, and there's rapid setup of it. Now, it's probably worth taking a moment to talk about why LSH. I think most of you on the call know what LSH is, but just one quick reminder. So Oracle Life Science Data Hub basically is a place where you can put data and keep it under regulatory control for long periods of time. And you can transform that data and then get that data back out again. So it doesn't do everything you need to support this overall process, but it is the main house and the main plumbing. It has the security. It has the blinding. It allows you to do dynamic pooling. It lets you do many of these types of things. And it also lets you work with many tools at once. So the investment case for LSH is if you believe that this rapid acquisition and rapid setup of studies and long-term storage in a regulatory compliant way is a goal of your business, it is at that point that LSH is into play. It's less expensive to invest in LSH if you architect it properly than it is to build your own. And there are competing products out on the market that cover sections of this overall architecture, but don't really have the big picture. They might handle the conforming step, or they might handle the analysis step, but they're not really built to be an enterprise application that handles the entire flow for the entire clinical development and safety process. Okay. So that being said, LSH includes most of the infrastructure you need, the core infrastructure, the security, the tracing, the version control, the runtime control, the scheduling, all of that, the blinding. That's included with LSH. But what we have actually seen is that to support the full business process, there are some gaps, and Oracle is actually filling some of these gaps as time goes by. But if you were to be successful today, you need to fill some of these gaps. So what we've seen is these are typically the The add-on utilities, so it's not a customization of LSH, but this is to supplement LSH to actually make this all work in a smooth way. So the first is a file loading utility. So you really need to be able to just point a file and say, build me one of these. If you're familiar with LSH, the way that works today is you have to actually say, this is what my loading data model is going to be, and then you can load a file to describe the data model, or you can actually just type it out, or you can get some pre-built data models. And then you have to load in the data model one file at a time after you do some individual steps under version control, checking it in, installing it, etc. All of those are very important steps, and you need them from a control standpoint. But end users don't care about a lot of that stuff. They're like, I have a file, I want to load it. And that needs to be their experience. So what we've seen is in the real world, there's file loading utilities. The data management workbench has some file loading capability as well, so they further automated it, making investments there. But BioPharm and other companies have built file loading utilities because they're actually essential to the successful use of a system like this. The next thing I want to talk about is study templates. So conceptually, you could build each study from scratch, and you could say, this is my source structure, this is my target structure, this is the mapping between the source and the target, and these are the reports that sit on top of it. The problem with that is that it's not very efficient. And so what you need to really do is set up a set of templates that follow the procedures that you're going to go through so the user has never just encountered an empty study. They basically have a study that's 60% set up, then they can load the test data and actually work as a delta. This enforces standards, it enforces naming convention, enforces structure, and it also reduces the overall amount of work. So whatever time you spend building out the study templates is time that will be paid back manyfold as you move through each one of the studies. Now, most companies have built these templates organically. That means when they start their projects, their LSH projects, they would typically pick 3 or 4 pilot studies and build them out one piece at a time. And then they look at the patterns after having some best practice in place, and then they actually convert those to templates. So it's not that you have to come in with all the templates perfect. And we have best practices at BioPharm about how to build these templates and what to leave as standard and what to leave as just a starting point for a particular study. The belief really is that you also need a data mapping application. It is possible to write a specification and then just write SAS code, PL SQL code, Informatica, etc. And it's just very labor intensive. And we've had success with that, but our best practice has told us that a dedicated mapping tool that really just involves the specification of the mapping is much more efficient. The other advantage of this is if you specify the mapping, you have documented evidence of exactly how things got from point A to point B. So essentially you have a document and not just some code that's sitting there. And it's a document that's human readable. And that's very, very important, as we talked about in Conforming. So this is a very important component, the data mapping application. And when we talk about some of these utilities, you'll see there are a few data mapping options that you have there. Doing it as free coding does get the job done, but again, it's not very efficient and it's not really scalable. If you have centrally located IVRS or LIMS systems, it's important to have a utility around those that blind data. As I mentioned earlier, these systems typically would have all of the study data in a set of normalized tables, where if someone has access to it, they can all the PK data or all the randomization data right away across all the studies, and that just doesn't work. So you need a set of utilities that essentially mask that data and create these study-specific views automatically. So the study teams do nothing but copy their template, fill out some configuration, and so they're getting the IVRS data and the lab data right alongside the EDC data. Next utility that we have seen is a coding utility. So whether you use a commercial coder, such as the Oracle Thesaurus Management System, or you're doing your coding internally, recoding of data is a very important step that can occur. You may not actually want a discrepancy management around coding. So for example, if a code doesn't match, you might not want to go to the EDC system and throw a discrepancy, create a discrepancy. Or you may want to do that. But certainly the ability to point different coding dictionaries, different code mappings to a particular set of data so that you can harmonize the vocabulary is an important utility that you really need in an environment like this. If you're going to be pooling studies across programs or even within programs, it's very important that the language that you speak and the terminology is the same. So having a utility that actually integrates this data with some sort of vocabulary or terminology management is very important. And the last piece is a pooling utility. This essentially is a form of unioning together conformed data sets. It's a little more sophisticated than that because if you have two columns with different data types, it needs to be managed. If they have different lengths and precisions, they need to be managed. Some studies have variables that other studies don't have. These types of things all need to be handled. But conceptually, it's really just, I want to look at these studies together in a single data set. All of that can be done by hand in LSH, but it is very cumbersome and tedious. And it's a lot easier if you could just say, hey, I just want to pool these 6 data sets. Please give me a pool view. So these are the utilities that we found in a real implementation are necessary to complete the picture from a utility standpoint. Now, each one of these utilities is fairly complex to work with, but if you have them as a library of utilities that you can work with, the end user really should just be copying their study templates, and these utilities should automatically be being taken advantage of. This is a screenshot of a typical best practice organization. It's just a demo area where basically we recommend, they're called domains. For those of you not familiar with LSH, it's like a foldering scheme where basically you would store your standards and templates in one area and your utilities in another area, and then you'd have your study-specific and project-specific items in a folder. And the way this works is your templates, you would copy a template down to a specific area. That points back to your utilities. That points back to your target standards, your mapping tools, and all that. And then you have a separate set of folders for the different utilities I was talking about. File loading, pooling, IVRS, etc. Those utilities are basically available for the administrators and for some of your utility administrators. But in general, the end users don't ever get to see them or touch them. They don't work in those areas. Those areas are really there from an administrative standpoint. And it's your templates that point back to the calls on those utilities. The end user doesn't need to be bothered with them. But they can take full advantage of them on their study-specific and their project areas, not really realizing necessarily even that it's not part of the core LSH environment itself. Okay, so now I'm going to talk about, that's great, lots of cool stuff, moving parts. What do you actually need? Well, you need a production environment size for the service level. So it's very important that if you're doing this 3 hops of data and you're doing that twice a day, you've got your code, particularly your conforming and pooling code and transformation code, needs to be optimized. But you need the right hardware and you need the right underlying infrastructure. So you need to actually have a projection of the number of studies, the amount of going forward, so you can make sure that your hardware on the production side is already sized appropriately. And that would include your fault tolerance and your disaster recovery as well. You need a test and validation. So this is for when new versions of LSH come out, when new versions of utilities come out, when you have new tools, etc. You need to test all that stuff. And you need to test it in a way that's regulatory compliant. And then you need access to a sandbox or development environment. So this is a place where you can try to enhance these utilities if you'd want to, or maybe you have your own ideas and your own systems that you want to play with. Basically a place where you kind of have open access. There's no truly blinded patient data in such a sandbox, but it's somewhat of an area where you can do exploration about this infrastructure and how you want to put it together. Now, we work with other companies that actually have pre-production environments and their tests are separate from their validation environment, but we really found that this 3 environments is all that's necessary. Because within LSH itself, you have domains and you have work areas that are test, prod, and development. So if you're working within the environment, even your production environment has the ability to do some experimentation. So really these three environments we think are sufficient to cover almost all cases. And this is a diagram and an example production environment. So I'm not going to actually walk through this, but what I want to point out is there's a lot of boxes and lines. So in order to have the vision to get the smooth flow, LSH takes care of the database part, and that's a three-tier application, so there's a middle tier. But you've got things like Spotfire. You have to have SAS, LSH. That may be on another box, be it virtual or real. Your Spotfire, JReview, if you're using Informatica, if you're using OBIEE. It's quite a complex physical architecture. Some of these can be virtual machines. Some of these can be physical machines. And setting this up, if you don't know what you're doing, can be somewhat confusing unless you're very experienced. And that's kind of the advantage of working with a hosting partner like BioPharm. There are other hosting partners as well that work, Oracle hosts as well. The advantage I think we have with BioPharm is that we have partnerships with a lot of the third-party vendors. And we'll talk about that in a minute. So how do I rapidly get this set up? So what are the tasks? So I've got this complex infrastructure that needs to be put in place. Typically, a project would start with a sandbox development installation. You do that very, very quickly. Get that up and get that into the team's hands very quickly. We then follow with a requirements workshop. So there's a series of best practices that we go over in much more detail than we've discussed in this talk, but that needs to be brought into your company's specific business processes. Now this is a regulatory system, so you need all the requirements and design documents set up. You need to take your dev or sandbox environment and configure them according to those requirements. You'll need all the validation tasks of OQ, PQ, IQ, and you need to execute those in your test or validation environment. Set up that same environment in production, build training, and then go through ongoing support. So the question is, how can you do that rapidly? And the answer really is to have a set of predefined templates, both on the infrastructure side and on the validation side, that are ready to go to accelerate the overall process. Okay. So now we're going to talk a little bit more BioPharm focused. So this best practices that I've been talking about could be accomplished by any team or any company if they took enough time to figure it out. At BioPharm, we've actually got a set of pre-configured environments that allow for the rapid installation of LSH. We have templates for the validation documentation, both the requirements and the design, so that really it's a matter of adjusting those to exactly what your company's business needs are. We've got utilities pre-built for file loading, SAS macro-based loading and extract, data pooling, blinding sources such as IVRS and labs. The utilities are ready to go. There's not a discussion about how do you build those. We have a fully functional integrated mapper available. Now, there really, in my view, are a couple mappers on the market that are really focused on this. There's a mapper that the BioPharm has built that has specifically been built to work for clinical data and to work with that process-based approach. The data management workbench that has just come out from Oracle also has a mapper. And in fact, the BioPharm mapper can interact with the Oracle mapper. The Oracle mapper is new, and it has a lot of nice features. It hasn't focused much on the specification and sharing process, but it's certainly a valid mapper. There are many other metadata mapping tools available out there in the market. From what I have seen, none of them are particularly focused on the business process side, and are much more focused on the technical mapping to avoid having to write programs. We also include templates for validation document, and of course you need training classes as well. So all that stuff is pre-configured, essentially, if you work with BioPharm. This is an example of a mapper screen. So you can see this is something really that a data manager and a statistician can just sit down and look at and email back and forth and manage. And it doesn't necessarily require a huge amount of technical expertise to use it. Now, we do these types of projects both in the cloud and, or hosted, I should say, and we do them on-premise. So one of the things that we provide is dedicated environments in the cloud. So this is the idea that it's not the cloud where you don't know what your computer is. It's a specific computer in a specific location that can be audited. So unlike the Amazon cloud where you have no idea where your data is and all the regulatory problems with that, although from a marketing standpoint we use the term cloud, it's more of the classic hosting where we actually know exactly where your data is. In particular for the European regulations are very strict about where your data is, and you have to know exactly where it is at all times, so that's an important feature. So as part of that hosting, we would have LSH, potentially Study Mapper, OBIEE, which is the analysis tool that Oracle has. We're experts in that. But we also have partnerships with SAS. We have partnerships with Spotfire, with JReview. So it's not like you're picking and choosing which environments and which companies to work with. We actually have the ability to set up the entire ecosystem across all of the technologies to actually set something like this up if you choose to host with BioPharm. Again, we can do these projects hosted or on-premise, or we can even work with third-party hosters. But just to give you some information, that we have experts that can actually put that complex architecture together very, very rapidly. And conceptually, that whole infrastructure becomes part of your internal network with persistent VPN so that it's somewhat invisible that things are even at BioPharm for the end users. We work through several implementation packages. We can do either fixed price or time and materials based, depending on your needs and level of customization. But we don't just offer, hey, here's hosting, or hey, we'll install the software. We have the ability to actually do the full life cycle all the way through to ongoing technical support. And that gives you the full validation pack, so you don't have to write all those PQ, IQ tests from scratch. It's a very labor-intensive piece that we've got some predefined templates for. Take a minute to talk about support, and then I'll open it up for question. So at BioPharm, we do something a little bit different with support. So if you host with us, we do actually fully support the application. You know, if there's some reason it's down, someone can't log in, you need to recover from backup. So that's what we call technical support, and that's available. And any hosting company really would give you that. That's not really anything too amazing, although it's absolutely essential. The other thing is our support, and this is not really an extra fee, includes application support. And application support isn't just logging bugs, but it means that you can get on the phone, you can log a ticket, or you can get on the phone with our team, and we'll actually walk you through your problem. So if you're having a problem writing a particular program, and that's a SAS program, and it's not due to some bug in LSH or some bug in the environment, you just need some help there. Our support includes that. There are some limits on it if it gets completely crazy, but the idea is as part of the fixed price, and you're having trouble doing something, the support at BioPharm actually will get on the phone with you and discuss the best practice and help you essentially debug what your issues are beyond just bugs within the application. Because you're actually building mappings and you're building programs and you're writing programs and writing reports, we're experts in those applications themselves, and our support actually includes that. So that's something that's extremely different. Typically that's done as consulting on top of support, but we consider that just as much an important part of day-to-day support as the technical support. And then we have things like multilingual and 24/7 if needed. So rapid release. So one of the things is rapid setup of studies, but also how could we get an environment like this up rapidly? So for a hosted solution, we can get you a sandbox environment within 2 to 4 weeks, and potentially, depending on the level of customization and integration, validation production environment in 4 to 6 months. So the idea that you would get going in less than a year, then you have this full-blown infrastructure. So I'm not talking about just LSH, But LSH with Spotfire, with JReview, with all these utilities in place, is pretty unusual in the marketplace if you've been looking around. We also have partnerships with a number of companies where we can resell licenses. You don't have to by any means, where essentially you can go to a single contract, single monthly payment, and basically say, okay, I want all this stuff, and I just want one monthly payment, and then I know what my total cost is, and I don't have to go and calculate costs running around to all these different vendors and getting all these different maintenance costs. So single location, single cost. The other thing is we generally plan out our hardware growth with you, and we don't have an upcharge just because we need to expand the hardware. There are some limits. You can't go from 4 terabytes to 50 petabytes without some discussion with us. But the general growth that you would experience as you add more and more studies is included in kind of just your monthly hosting fees. And we would, in a very controlled and validated way, swap out a larger hardware as needed. And you don't have to actually buy that hardware. It's just part of hosting. So it's very much an experience of, hey, I know exactly what my invoice is going to be every month, and I get the whole infrastructure and all the support around that. So it's very low risk. And because we're so experienced in setting up these environments, we can do so very quickly. So the conclusion really is the best practice should minimize the costs and risks of managing the patient data. And those risks include, the risks associated with not being able to review your data from safety. You really have to be able to look at that stuff and review it right from day one and run that analysis. We think that the LSH with several utilities enables the best practice. We have a predefined mapping utility that does some real acceleration. It's optional, of course, but it's there. We have implementation templates for all aspects. And if you choose to host, we can get things up very, very quickly. I want to say one more thing about the data management workbench. This is a new product which Oracle has released several weeks ago. Again, it layers on top of LSH and it's a much nicer user interface for many of the steps that we've talked through here. The steps themselves do not change, and the approach doesn't really change. In addition, the data management workbench includes an Inform adapter and a bidirectional discrepancy management system for Inform, although it's unidirectional for other data management systems. So essentially, you can do any kind of discrepancy management you want with Inform. That will become part of our hosted ecosystem as time goes by, and we're ready to go with that now, but not as a fixed price at this point in time. We see the basic best practice not changing. We see that as Oracle has invested in data management workbench around LSH, it actually improves the overall user experience. So that's something that we're involved in as well. But it's obviously we don't have templates for a product that's come out so recently. So that's a word about data management workbench. But the focus really is, go live quickly and have a set of best practices around a complete infrastructure ready to go so that the study teams really are working as quickly as possible. So with that, we have about 6 minutes for questions and answers. You can enter your questions. We have a few here. Let me just read through them. Okay. So first question is, to my knowledge, no company has built a complete set of protocol standards to which they can leverage across all of trial design. It's been my experience that any standards developed in-house should be closely tied with regulatory expectations, CDISC, etc., and positioned to scale easily within the industry, yet still be backward compatible with previous standards. Is this type of versioning available in this system? Okay. So within this infrastructure, if you would use the BioPharm's mapping tool, that is definitely available. The idea is really, there's standards. Standards are always a slowly moving target, but they're never completely static. So you do need to keep them under control, and you do need to keep a history so that you can maximize reuse and say exactly what was used and where. If you're actually doing your conforming mapping yourself through some sort of custom coding, it becomes a little bit more difficult to track which standards were followed and when. Certainly you can tell on the conforming target side which standards were used, but on the EDC side it's much more difficult to track the standards. Although the reality is that every single data structure, both source and target, in the Life Sciences Hub is tracked under version control, so you can track it. The ability to get to it is a little bit more complex without a mapping tool that's specifically designed to handle that. The next question, I'm just going through them chronologically until I run out of time here. Will this slide deck be available for download? Yeah, this presentation will be available for replay. I'm not sure, Eugene, if the deck itself will be downloadable.
Yeah, we'll actually make it available.
Okay. The next question I have is, do I know of customers who are in production with LSH? I do know of quite a few customers that are in production with LSH. I'm not going to list them in the call here, but yes, I know of both successful and less successful projects with LSH, and quite a few customers that are in production are using it for every single one of their studies right now. So LSH is about 6 or 7 years old. The first couple of years there was slow uptake. I think about 2 or 3 years ago, quite a few of the large companies really picked it up. A number of those large companies are in production, and a number of medium-sized companies are in production and have been for several years now. And there are quite a few that are also in sort of the pre-production stage as well. Okay, the next question is there an idea distinguishing between user requirements and the detailed specifications when discussing generating the conform mapping? I think there is. I view, this is my opinion, I view user requirements really along the business process. How do I want my business process to flow? And they're not really study specific. The conforming and mapping specification is very much a study specific. It's like specifying the edit checks on a particular study. So that tends to be very data management focused. But the general user requirements about how you want this data flow to be is not a study specific requirements. And that's handled much more, I would think, like a typical system where you have user requirements. There's a question about DME, which is the DMW, which I think I discussed. I'm going to skip that for right now. There's another question here about what are the best practices that you need to use LSH in the cloud? Okay, so that's quite a large topic. So the key is A, your security and your provisioning in your organization needs to work with what you're doing in the cloud. B, for large data transfers, although you will have a virtual private network that allows you to create database links so that you can direct connect your systems inside your infrastructure to the cloud-based systems. And I'm speaking specifically of BioPharm's cloud, not necessarily of Oracle's cloud, but I think a lot of this applies as well. We have found that for large file transfers or for large data volumes, it's actually better to FTP the data across and then automatically load it. So everything's fully automated. The end user doesn't see anything. But that for medium and small data transfers, it actually makes sense to actually just use the live links, the database links. The other thing in the cloud is it's very important that tools like Spotfire, JReview, etc., that they reside in the cloud as well. If you have your reporting tools and your analysis tools outside the cloud and it has to go across the internet, we found performance to be a problem for large studies and for large analyses. If you want things to be very snappy and responsive, it's important that your reporting tools are sitting in the cloud as well. The other thing is you need the cloud, as I already mentioned, to be a physical place where someone can go and can audit and say, yes, this is where my data is sitting. And this is very important. And I think if you're working in the regulatory compliant industry, this is essential. And that's why the Amazon cloud is just not going to work, because you just don't have that type of option. The next question, and I'm just going to take this as the last one, is do we host Argus as well, and do we have experience integrating with LSH? Yes, we do host Argus as well, and we do have experience integrating with LSH. We've done loose integration where we've actually had AEs coming into LSH, and that generates E2B messages that are then pushed to Argus, and that goes back and forth. And we've actually taken the Argus database itself and have views into LSH so that you can do things like data mining and use mining tools directly against the Argus data and combine that with other data. So we've done a number of integrations. I'm looking at my clock. I'm seeing just about finished up the time here. So I'm going to hand it back to Eugene. If you have further questions, I'm sure we can answer those offline as well.
Great. Thanks, Mike. So a few questions came in recently, and we'll try to get back to you. Or if you have additional questions, feel free to reach out to us. The contact us slide is in front of you right now. And one other name and email address I'll just give you verbally is Mike Grossman, and his email address is mgrossman@biopharm.com. If you have any specific questions, you can either email Roderick, or you can email Mike Grossman, and one of them will get back to you. So that'll do it for our presentation. Our next presentation will be on Oracle's clinical development analytics, and that will take place in November. We look forward to having you join us then. Keep in mind that this webinar is being recorded, and I will send everyone a link to the recording as well as a link to the presentation tomorrow. Once again, thank you so much for joining us, and we hope that this presentation has been helpful. Take care.